Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our discussion of not shutting up about journalism. I'm Lori Hearn, the CEO, the editor, and the founder of inewsource. I thank you all for supporting our mission and our work, deep, fact-based journalism that addresses issues we care about in this region, from infrastructure to health to the environment. These efforts include stories about people who have no voice and are neglected by the media. Our mission is to serve the people of this region with the kind of journalism that holds powerful people to account and makes lives better for everyone. Thank you to our Spotlight Club members, some of you for being part of inewsource for many years, and some of you tonight. We hope you'll be inspired to join our Spotlight Club. So again, welcome. We've tried to deal with a few housekeeping matters, but there's always a few more. So a couple reminders, please stay on mute for the discussion so we can avoid background noises and other voices. Please excuse my dog. If he starts barking, I'll try to curtail that. And please put questions in the chat or unmute yourself and speak up. We're happy to have interruptions as we go on. We really do want this to be a conversation. So the title of tonight's program is Not Shutting Up About Journalism. It's taken from our guest, Dick Tofel's book, published in 2020, that reprints columns he wrote for ProPublica, the national newsroom powerhouse based in New York. Not shutting up comes from a tweet that Dick delivered to Steve Bannon days into the Trump administration. Bannon called the press on Twitter the opposition party and said it should, quote, keep its mouth shut. Dick responded on Twitter that we are not the opposition. We are just trying to report the truth, and we will not shut up. We are honored to have all of you here tonight to join in a conversation that has been going on actually for decades. When I was a Nieman Fellow back in 1994 at Harvard, when the internet was brand new, there was actually a printed yellow pages with URLs listed. Some of you might remember that. Seems really crazy now. Our group spent a lot of time hand-wringing over the future of news in the digital age. Who would have thought that the conversation would just get more complicated with browsers and search engines and social media? There are few more qualified to talk about the state of the media, its convulsions, and some hopeful developments than Dick Tofel. Dick was the founding general manager and first employee of ProPublica from 2007 to 2012, and its president until last September. As president, he had responsibility for all of ProPublica's non-journalism operations. That's communications, legal, development, finance, budgeting, human resources, everything. During the period of Dick's business leadership, ProPublica published stories that won 7 Pulitzer Prizes, among many other prestigious awards. Also during this time, ProPublica grew from a staff of just over 20 to more than 160 and raised more than $225 million from other than its founding funders. Dick was formerly the assistant publisher of the Wall Street Journal and immediately prior to ProPublica, president, general counsel, and secretary of the Rockefeller Foundation. Thank you for joining us tonight, Dick.
Thank you, Lori, for having me. It's great to be with you all.
So let's dive right in. For those who are not super familiar with ProPublica, I'm sure they maybe have heard the name. Can you tell us a little bit about how it started, why it started, what was the context, what was the need?
Sure. So ProPublica is actually the brainchild of a couple named Herb and Marion Sandler from the Bay Area, and Paul Steiger, who was its founder and original editor and CEO. The Sandlers had been very fortunate and had made a lot of money in the banking business. And when they retired when they sold that business, they became full-time philanthropists, as they were for the rest of their lives. And one of the things that they wanted to do was an initiative, investigative journalism, because it was clear to them at this point, 2006-07, that investigative journalism was under threat from the business crisis of the press that really began to emerge with the rollout of broadband video. So our mission from the first has been to do investigative journalism that spurs change. That's how ProPublica's success is measured. but we focused on that from the beginning. And you charted the growth, so I'll skip that story, but that's pretty much how we got started and why.
So Dick, you started with, I'm sure, it was a very large investment, as I recall, from the Sandler family. But where did you see your huge growth spurts?
Yeah, so we one of the first things after a year or two was to transition from the Sandlers, who were giving the bulk of the money, to we knew that was not sustainable, both not in perpetuity, and it's not a healthy thing, right? So we began to transition away from that, raise other funds. We made a good bit of progress on that to the point where we had them down to, I guess, $4 million of a budget of perhaps 13 by the time Donald Trump was elected president. And that really was a transformative moment for us. As some of you may recall, the Sunday night after that, John Oliver went on his show on HBO and said, well, you know, there's a lot of things that are obviously going to change in the world. And if you care about this, you should give this cause, you should give to these people, and that cause, that people. And then he said, no matter what you care about, we're going to need great journalism in this country more than ever. So I would urge people to subscribe to the New York Times or the Washington Post, or give money to ProPublica. And boom, I mean, literally the rate of small donations, which is a very important indicator, went up. It had already been up maybe 5 or 6 times in the 5 days before this, since the election. And then it went up 10, 20, 100 times. So the budget quickly went from 14 million to 20 million, 25 million, so that last year ProPublica spent $33 million. And this year we'll spend $40 million.
I very much remember that John Oliver segment, and I remember thinking, how do we get on John Oliver? So let me just say that we at inewsource have always looked at ProPublica and considered ourselves ambitiously a local ProPublica, because we're founded on similar principles of government accountability. We seek to cover relevant issues to people that others are not covering, and because we strive for impact, positive change for communities. And you mentioned that is kind of the reason ProPublica exists. Can you talk a little bit about how you measure impact and why it's so crucial in journalism today, especially in this time of 24/7 headlines and Apple News headlines?
Sure, we tried to be very clear about this over the years. When we say impact, we mean real world change. We mean a story that convinces people to change a law or to change a public policy, that if you reveal wrongdoing, leads to wrongdoers being punished, or if people have been unjustly accused or incarcerated, leads to them being released. So it's very specific. We call it out every time it happens and report about it publicly 3 times a year, which I think is key. The best way, excuse me, to have a real check on whether you're having the impact you claim is to claim it publicly. Because in the modern world, if you take credit for something in public and you don't deserve it, people are going to get on Twitter and Facebook and wherever and call you out on that. So it's a really good check, I think, as well as being a important means of transparency.
And just to ask another little question about this impact and kind of keeping the stories you do in the public view, there's a lot of debate in the journalism world about crossing that line into advocacy. So if you promote the stories you have done, how do you see that line where you don't really want to cross that, where people, because that's a credibility issue, right? If you start to advocate for positions.
Of course. I think, Lori, the big difference is advocacy. Journalism starts with questions. Good journalists always start with questions. Advocates, it's noble work, but they start with the answer. They know what they think, they know what they're trying to get done, and they're trying to convince people to come to seeing their way of the world. Journalism is different from that. It's trying to understand the world and report it out to readers and viewers. I do think one thing which is not advocacy, and it's an important line, is once you've done that work, once you've established the facts, I think to remind people of them frequently, which is, was much more common, frankly, in the late 19th century crusading journalism, I think that's actually perfectly appropriate. And the internet really facilitates it. When you don't have a limited space for news, a page that is only a certain size and only a certain number of pages, you can make the same point over and over again, or remind people, we reported this out and these are the facts. That is not, in my view, advocacy. It is journalism as long as it is supported by journalistic work. You're muted, Lori.
Somebody gave me a Christmas mug that said you're on mute. Moving along. ProPublica's real important work is doing investigative work that really moves the needle for people. But does ProPublica, have you had to wrestle with the issue of time-consuming, impactful journalism and the need to stay out in front of the public with some frequency? Does ProPublica have that, has had that issue and struggled with that, or is it just that ProPublica is now well known enough? I think this is something that many local organizations struggle with.
I think if you have a limited size, and ProPublica certainly still, for a national organization, has a limited size. I mean, it's probably what, a tenth the size of the New York Times or the Washington Post. That yes, it's important, I think, in the modern world, if you want to establish regular readership, to publish something essentially every business day at a minimum. And sometimes that's really easy, and sometimes it requires more planning and rearranging of things. And I do think that's an issue. The ability to follow up and to cut big stories into smaller pieces is one thing that can help that. But I think that's an issue for pretty much all digital news organizations.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about local news, and as opposed to national, where ProPublica focuses on. Maybe you can give the audience a bit of a lesson on, where we are with local news. Back when you and I were starting in the nonprofit space, large newspapers, metro, small papers were going out of business. They were shrinking. What does that landscape look like today?
I think, unfortunately, it's continuing to decline. I mean, the signs of this are everywhere. Just recently, for instance, Gannett indicated, which is one of the largest chain publishers in the country, that they're discontinuing the Saturday edition of local newspapers in 125 communities around the country. Most cities at this point in the country do not have 7-day print newspapers, or if they do, they will not for very much longer. The sizes of those staffs across the country are shrinking across the board. Print circulation is falling considerably. Some of that is readers, the fact that print readers are by and large older, and younger people are certainly picking up the news habit in various ways, but not picking up the print habit. Advertising online is now almost completely controlled by basically 3 entities. Facebook, Google, and Amazon is a real oligopoly, and the advertising revenues available to almost anybody else really are quickly approaching an effective zero. So local news is under, for-profit legacy local news is under enormous pressure all across the country. And I think this is of no fault of the editors, but it's just harder to do the job with less. You know, one of the sort of polite lies that goes along with, you know, the old-fashioned check is in the mail is we're going to do more with less. Mostly with less, people do less.
Mhm. So how does the nonprofit movement fit into this? We had a little conversation the other day about there is a kind of a wellspring of small community organizations trying to make their way.
Yeah, there's really actually been a real explosion of them around the country, of which inewsource is very much a part. It was at the early edge of it, that I think is enormously encouraging. And the key to that business model is to help people understand, one hopes, that you need to pay, journalism needs to be paid for, that if advertising is going to pay for it, readers are going to need to pay for it, that you probably and locally don't want and shouldn't want a hard paywall to prevent people from getting to the content, because it's going to restrict the content to a relatively small number of people with an unusually large amount of money. And what that means is you need to look to readers, average readers, as many as you can, and then readers who may be able to afford more to contribute and help the product along as you can find.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we discussed that there are more than 350 members of the Institute for Nonprofit News now, which is the umbrella organization for nonprofits. Many of them are run by just a handful of people. Most of them, I think, are run by a handful of people. The same with the Lion organization, which also represents for-profit entrepreneurs.
Right. I mean, the average is, I think at INN, it's 7 or 8 people. At Lion, it's 5 or 6.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to return to a second to what you said earlier about newspapers. And so I just want to kind of look out there at the audience, and if you raise your hand, how many of you get your news in print at least once a week? Oh, I thought it would be more, but okay. So Dick, I want to ask you that you have actually in one of your columns advocated for the end of print publications, particularly in papers that are not part of big chains. Can you talk about your thinking about that?
Sure. I mean, the print newspaper is really the classic 19th century economies of scale business. Publishing the first copy is very, very expensive. Publishing the 1001st copy is relatively inexpensive compared to the 1000th copy. So you get, as you go up the chain, you get more and more efficient, and you can lower the price. And for many, many decades, that worked out very well. The problem with manufacturing businesses like that is that when the quantity starts to shrink, when demand shrinks, it becomes less and less and less efficient, as it does, as you go in reverse. And so what happens is, and this is probably why there were so few hands up, expenses grow, the papers tend therefore to deliver the paper less out from the city center. That is to say, they contract the delivery area to closing in on the city center. And at the same time, they raise the price while limiting the product they're delivering. Well, as Barnum said, you cannot fool all the people all the time. So if some people can't get it, and if it has less, and if it costs more, you're headed into a downward spiral. And while newspaper publishers have been trying to slow the speed of this, it's getting very close to the point where print is simply uneconomic. That is to say, printing the last copy or the last few copies, or even the last few hundred copies, won't work. Nobody will be willing to pay you enough to offset the cost. So what you really want to do over time, but as quickly as you can, is transition readers to a digital format of delivery.
So we have a question from somebody in the audience here, and I guess it goes to like the effectiveness of the print media, if it still has clout. How can the print media effectively show, and this is the questioner's words, the outrageous questioning and rude treatment of Justice Brown Jackson by senators like Cruz, Hawley, and Cotton?
How can the print, I'm sorry, how can
the print media effectively show? And this is
well,
like,
I was actually just watching it before coming to join you, and I personally agree that what I just saw was infuriating, and frankly, I think it's infuriating on a bipartisan basis. I mean, in a session that is convened to ask somebody questions, who in the world needs to give a 20-minute speech before they start asking somebody questions? And everybody did that. I mean, literally not one of them could resist their moment in the spotlight. So, but I think you can convey that in print quite powerfully. And, things like, how important is your faith to you on a scale of 1 to 10? It seems to me the outrageousness of that question is equally evident in print as it is in video.
thank you for that. So turning to another related topic, you and I have spent our careers in media and the last 12 years in the nonprofit media. But I personally feel like we're at another pivotal point, just like we were back in 2007, 8, and 9. People are turning more and more to their screens, as we just talked about, print, and to audio and other kinds of ways of receiving information. What is our responsibility, or perhaps our imperative, to meet consumers where they are with what they want?
It's the old thing about if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, right? If we're reporting, but nobody's receiving, or they're not receiving in a way that's useful to them or convenient to them or informative to them, then we're not informing them. So, and what you have here, again, if you look broadly, all these media are in the process of converging. So the line between television and radio and newspapers has gotten enormously blurry. And I think that's actually a good thing. In digital, you can deliver a representative snippet of video. You can deliver a long form audio if you want. You can use graphs and big data in ways you couldn't otherwise and make it sortable. So there are enormous numbers of new ways to tell stories. And I think the best journalism these days is the best there's ever been, because it is possible to tell stories in creative ways, but you have to stay at the curve in the ability to do that. If people want a shorter version, you need to be able to give it to them. On the other hand, for great narrative writing, there is still quite a willingness on people. I mean, this is demonstrated every day. Great writing people will read.
So we have a question also from the audience here, Dick, that follows up on that. What about poorer communities or cities where they have much lower internet connectivity? Places where the print product was beloved and integral to community life. What about those communities?
Yeah, I actually think this is the most serious journalism problem we have in the country. I think this questioner is exactly right. We have less good answers for places where there is a lack of connectivity, although I should say that I think there is real hope, or real reason for hope, that problem is likely to fade pretty quickly. There's an enormous amount of money for it in the infrastructure bill. Real progress has been made on it and at the state level in many states. So literal lack of broadband connectivity, I have a feeling is a problem that is fading soon. But the more serious problem is the one the questioner identified earlier in their question, which is what about places where there's just less money? And that I do worry about quite a lot. You know, I've talked to people all the time in our field who talk about how they're helping teach people in smaller news outlets in smaller places how to raise revenues. And, you know, this I don't think applies in your community at all. But this, you know, the old line about it's great if you teach someone how to fish instead of just giving them a fish. Well, yes, and that's true. But if there are no fish in the river that runs by them, then teaching them how to fish is not going to help very much.
Yes, it's quite sobering. So here is the $64,000 question that we've kind of touched on a little bit through the discussion. With the internet, people have become accustomed to regarding news as free. There it is on their phone. I did a whole TEDx talk at San Diego State a couple of years ago on the importance of community and individual support for journalism. So you mentioned this, alluded to this earlier, but has the train left the station? Are we ever going to convince people that news is worth supporting, paying for? The one latte a month club? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, are we going to convince everybody? No, but, you know, look, half the people in this country don't vote, right? So, and that's a bigger problem even still. But are we going to convince many people who do value news and who want to stay informed, that if they want that it's an important value? I think the train has not left the station on that. People have understood in this country for a long time that a range of cultural activities, for instance, need to be supported in a nonprofit way. And they are. Everybody pretty much knows, who cares, that you won't have good museums without the people who really care deeply pitching in, or performing arts institutions, or private universities, or private hospitals. It doesn't mean that every single person who uses those resources pays, or that every person who enjoys them or thinks they benefit the community, but the people who care the most do, and they do enough so that leading communities, healthy communities, have all of those things. And I think what we're in the middle of people beginning to understand in this country is that the news, this didn't used to be the case 20 years ago, but today the news is on that list of things where there's a market failure. That is to say, the free market is not going to provide as much of this good as we need, and you need to address them in the way that you do these other market failures in cultural institutions, for instance.
Thank you. So we have another question. What is an effective way to find out what your readers are interested in? And if you find out they're interested in certain things that you don't cover, and they're not interested in things you cover, is that a challenge? Do you give people just what they want?
Yeah, so it's a two-part question, both good, obviously. The first is, how do you figure out what people want? Actually, this is one of the amazing things of digital delivery, with precision. I mean, Lori, I'm sure you have, Chartbeat on your computer screen most of the workday, and it shows a publisher which, not only how many people are reading, but which articles they're reading and how long they're reading them for and where they're coming from. So an enormous amount about what moves people. And when people talk about trending things on social media or most viewed things on sites, there's an enormous amount of knowledge about what people want to read and what they will and won't read. So there's no excuse, frankly, for not knowing in general what your audience is interested in. They are telling you, voting with their feet, in effect, all the time. Now, the next question is the trickier one, which is, what do you do about it? This is what editors are paid to do. If you put up pictures of adorable puppies, you get a lot of views, and because people do like to look at adorable puppies, but you won't accomplish anything. Some things are, I think editors will say, simply so important that we need to talk about them. And ideally, we need to talk about them in a way that will engage people, that will explain to people why the editor's judgment is that they're so important. And again, you get instant feedback, so by the same token, the first President Bush, memorably, to me at least, said that one of the prerogatives, that he didn't like broccoli and he wasn't going to eat broccoli, and his mother had made him eat broccoli, and now he was the president of the United States and he didn't have to eat broccoli anymore. If you serve people a menu of all broccoli all the time, they're going to leave. And that, again, is what editing is about, I think, at one level, which is what's the mixture on a scale that runs from puppies to broccoli, and how do you mix it up and keep it interesting and relevant and compelling?
We're going to switch over to another question. We've actually had two questions that are kind of related on this point. One just came in, is there a remedy for disinformation? And another question we had that was sent in earlier was kind of related. What worries you the most? Suppression and distortion of facts by the government, or rejection and distortion of facts by the populace?
So is there a remedy for disinformation? I think you've seen, there's not a perfect one, or it would have stopped long ago. But I actually think the war in Ukraine is is illustrating a number of things about this in really interesting ways. One fix for it, which I think the government deployed very effectively, our government, in the month or so before the war, was to anticipate it and call it out when you knew it was coming, which actually is the case more often than one might think, I think. So I think that was effective. I think the other is talking to people, it was the phrase you used before, Lori, meeting people where they are. That video your former governor did earlier this week, talking to the Russian people, which last I looked had about 40 million views, with literally no paid marketing at all. I thought was enormously effective in the way that he first established a rapport with the audience in a very, very effective way before getting to his message. And I think there's all sorts of lessons in that about how to break through. Can you give me the second question over again? You're muted again, Lori.
Let me unmute myself again. Yes, the question is, what worries you the most? Suppression / distortion of facts by the government, or rejection and distortion of facts by the people?
Misinformation by the government always worries me more. First of all, we do live in a democracy, and people are entitled. They're not entitled to their own facts, but I think one does need to grant your fellow citizens the right to think that things that you think are enormously important are not important, and vice versa. If we're really committed to democracy, it does not mean we all have to see things exactly the same way. And I think if we're committed to democracy, we are making a joint bet that in the end, the truth will prevail. If you've lost your faith in that, and I can understand why your faith might be wavering some, but if you've lost your faith in that, you need to admit to yourself that you've lost your faith in democracy. Democracy is premised on the idea that the people will get it right. Not every time, right? What I always say to people is, Nixon was elected president twice. Herbert Hoover was elected president. The people make mistakes, not constantly, but in the end, I think there is a lot to the idea about the arc of history. On the other hand, the government has no excuse for misinforming the people. It is a betrayal of their oath. It is a betrayal of their job. There is no excuse for it.
On that note, we'll move on to another question. One of our audience has asked, ProPublica is large. Do you feel that ProPublica is reaching communities of color? And if you can't reach all socioeconomic communities, as large an organization as ProPublica is, how can an organization like inewsource ever accomplish this?
Yeah, this is a big issue. And the answer, because we do take surveys, they're not scientific surveys because those frankly are too expensive, but they're probably right, and they're certainly directionally right, is that the audience is not as diverse as you would want it to be. ProPublica has made an enormous amount of progress in diversifying its own staff. And to be candid with you, it has not moved the needle a lot on diversifying the audience. It writes about things of concern to a wide range of people in lots of different ways, and that hasn't either. To be honest with you, the thing that worries me the most is that a lot of news media have audiences that skew to the highly educated, particularly when you report about complex things. And if you look in this country, because of a long history of problems that we're all familiar with, the diversity of background among the highly educated is really not, I mean, it's a huge, huge problem. And if you look at people with graduate degrees in this country, for instance, the diversity in that group is awful. So that I think is a big problem, and there's a long-term solution, which is democratizing education, which is absolutely critical. But we do need solutions that get us from here to there. I mean, your editor, Mark Rochester, and I were together in Palo Alto recently, and Mark is helping lead an initiative, which I think is very, very important, to diversify editing ranks. It's sort of an analogous problem. The history of discrimination in the news business is terrible, and real progress has only been made in the last decade. Real meaningful, dramatic progress has really only been made in the last decade or so, or maybe two. Editors tend to be more experienced than reporters, so the diversity among editors is awful. Among young reporters, it's actually not bad. So you can say, well, it's not a problem. It'll all fix itself in 20 or 30 years. And that may be true. But what are you going to do in the next 20 or 30 years? And Mark's trying to work on that. And I think that kind of thing is a really important problem. It's true inside news organizations, but it's also true among readers.
And that seems to be a huge problem, Dick, is how do we also diversify our audiences? You know, when you talk about particularly organizations that write about complex topics, longer stories, you know, how do we reach the audiences who are really affected by what we're writing about? I think that's been a big problem for the media as well.
Right. And, you know, there are some very promising organizations, you know, particularly in a number of cities led by young people of color, and they are doing some very interesting things. Honestly, I have not yet seen results at scale that suggest that they've found some magic breakthrough either. It'd be great if they did, because if somebody discovers this, you ought to be able to figure out the secret sauce and make more of it.
If there is a secret sauce, right? That's the key. So we have a question about that relates to investigative journalism and the heft that comes with that. Many of you may have seen the recent news about BuzzFeed essentially getting rid of their investigative team and their investigative editors. They plan to divest themselves of investigative reporting, politics, and other significant reporting topics. Do you think BuzzFeed News can continue to be successful despite these plans, Dick?
I think when you look all the way through it, BuzzFeed is pretty clearly signaling that they're getting essentially out of the news business. They're still going to do the stuff that goes with their core business at BuzzFeed, listicles, celebrity stuff, viral videos, you know, literally on the puppy pictures end of the spectrum. But they're pretty clear in their announcement the other day that serious news is not really part of their mix, their product mix as they see it. I actually think this is a bigger story than it has been given credit for being, because what I think it means, BuzzFeed was one of the most, in my judgment, one of the most interesting new news organizations in the country. And it was the one that I thought a few years ago had the greatest potential for operating at sufficient scale to be profitable. And it turns out it couldn't. And what that means, I think, is that for-profit digital serious news, digital only, serious, for-profit, at a national scale, I don't think it's going to exist.
Okay. I just want to welcome all of you to unmute if you'd like to actually ask a question. I've been asking a number of your questions that have been coming through the chat, but we have a few more minutes. So does anyone have one they'd like to ask Dick themselves?
Yes.
Lori, I would. I would like to ask the question that you can't understand from me. Richard, ProPublica has done a lot of stories, and most of them have a lot of depth and gravitas. Has there ever been a story where it was really important, but it really didn't make any impact? And looking back, how could you have amplified that? And who within the organization in a nonprofit world could amplify it really to get that impact?
Yeah. So yeah, there've been a number. I mean, you know, you love to go brag about all the things that did make a big impact. The one that still burns at me the most is we did a extensive study in 2011 or so about racial bias in the pardons process. Enormously complicated statistical thing, and we really proved as a statistical matter that was racial bias in the presidential pardon process. That if you had committed the same crime, that you were far less likely to get a pardon if you were Black than if you were white. So we arranged to put this series on the front page of the Washington Post. And my business partner, Steve Engelberg, our editor, and I were sitting there going, you know, this is a slam dunk. At this point, the President of the United States, the First Lady of the United States, and the Attorney General of the United States are all African-American lawyers, right? And we have put this on the front page of their hometown paper and proved that this, right, that this is happening. Nothing happened. And we heard about a year later that the reason nothing had happened was because the Obama campaign team had said to the president, you can't do anything about this. We're months or a year or whatever away from the election. We can't be seen to be doing special favors for Black people. And, you know, so we just, there's no place on the agenda for this. You just want to shoot yourself in the head. But it's a pretty good metaphor for, it's not just you, and it's not just the story, and it's not just the placement. It's also, among many other things, but very, very importantly, as always in life, the timing.
It also happens too, and I'm sure it happens at ProPublica, where we get extremely frustrated because what the bureaucrats and the elected officials tend to do is just shut you down. You write something that's controversial, exposes some things, and then they pretend it didn't exist. And if they wait long enough, the media might move on. And
well, that's why, as I said at the beginning, one of my favorite tactics is not to move on.
Yeah.
You know, there's almost always a new illustration of an old problem.
All right. Any other questions?
Yes.
Goddess has one.
Joyce?
Richard, I'm
Oh.
just curious on your reflections on the purchase of Politico by a German company, the growth evolution of Politico, and then being purchased for big bucks. And what does that say to the industry?
So I think Politico is a fascinating business, but my analysis, and you're right, absolutely, it's been very successful. Politico, as you and I suspect you, but certainly I experience it, is for political junkies, and it has a lot of interesting stuff. That is not the heart of its business model. The heart of its business model is it is specialized news, in a lot of it in verticals, being sold in high price, very deep slices around the business of lobbying the Congress of the United States, which is an enormous business. As anybody who's, you know, particularly anybody, I see a little bit of white hair in the questioner, so I'm going to, you know, if you've been to Washington, if you were in Washington when you were young and you go back now, what you've discovered is that physically in the town, right, the amount of lobbying being done from fancy buildings, clearly run and operated by people with enormous amounts of money, is astonishing. And that is the heart of Politico's business as an enterprise. And they are hanging the political news operation sort of off of that. So I think it's a really interesting model. They do a lot of really good work, but I think it is not quite what it appears to be.
Speedy, it looks like you have a question.
Yeah, Lori, thank you very much for inviting us. And Dick, it's just been an excellent presentation. Thank you very much. The US Supreme Court has essentially invited a challenge to the actual malice standard on news reporting. And I'm wondering how you see that and what concerns it raises for news going forward.
Well, first of all, 2 justices of the Supreme Court have invited a challenge, and it takes 4 to hear a challenge, and it takes 5 to make one. So I do think we're a long way from that. I would be, you know, if the issue is tinkering with it at the margins, you know, for instance, at the level of, and this gets very into complicated stuff for mostly just for lawyers, but limited purpose public figures, I wouldn't worry about it so much. It wouldn't thrill me, but it's not the end of the world. If we're going to go turn over 58-year precedents that people have been relying on all over the country, because 5 people show up in Washington and decide they disagree, that's enormously troubling. I mean, my own view, and I retired from the practice of law about a month ago, but I was a practicing lawyer for most of the last 35, 40 years. Overturning precedents on which people rely is a bad idea. If it rely in an important way in their lives, is a really bad idea, and something that should be done almost never, unless you conclude that the values of the society have fundamentally changed. And I don't think on this there's any reason to think that.
Thank you, Dick. Does anybody else have any questions? Please raise your hand or speak up. No? All right.
Connie's up in the
I
corner
see
there.
Oh,
Hi,
I see
Connie.
the bottom.
Connie, I see you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
Connie.
I have one. We talked about the story that didn't get traction. In your view, what story had the greatest impact?
Oh, now you're asking somebody to choose between their children. You know, I've had a lot of favorites. I mean, one, Mark heard me tell this story when we were together a couple weeks ago, so I will beg his indulgence and tell it again. Early on in the history of ProPublica, we did a story about 2009 on the problems of nursing oversight in your state, and the problems in particular of the nursing board. We ran it in partnership with the Los Angeles Times. The 2 reporters who wrote the story, who are actually now the co-managing editors of ProPublica, but they were then reporters, had been at the LA Times, and so we published it with them. This is my second Arnold Schwarzenegger reference of the night, but you had your superhero governor at this time, and he walked in his office the next morning brandishing the Sunday Los Angeles Times and said, "This is an outrage and I want it fixed today." And his chief of staff apparently said to him, "Well, Governor, we can't do that." And he said, "Why not?" He said, "Because you appointed the entire nursing board." And the great thing about being a superhero, right, is he said, "I don't care. Fire them all. Do it today." And he did. So that doesn't happen very often in journalism, but when it does, you know, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you all. I want to respect your time. Thank you, Dick, very much for an interesting conversation. Thank you all for your participation and your attendance. And thank you for your membership in the Spotlight Club. I do want to have you all remind you to mark your calendars for June 5th. We are very much hoping that we are going to have our first in-person Spotlight Club event on that date at 3 o'clock. More details to come, but we hope we'll see you all there. So thank you very much.
Great to be with you. Thank you.